Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Halliday of the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of a two-part event on global freedom, a panel discussion on how to accelerate global freedom via a liberty-expanding collaboration on multinational agreements. For those of us who've been involved in the COP process, I'm sure many would agree that a consolidated message from the liberty movement is missing from those negotiations, and that's what we want to change. I'd like to thank Atlas Network and its staff for assistance in helping us put this event together. Also, this event, like all Atlas events, is on the record, is being recorded, so if you don't wish to be identified, please let me know. To start off this morning's proceedings, we have Nick Gillespie. He is editor-at-large of Reason Magazine, co-host of the Reason Roundtable, award-winning journalist, author, and we're really pleased that he'll be moderating this morning's discussion. Thanks, Nick. Magat Wade from Senegal. She's an entrepreneur and executive director of the Atlas Network Center for African Prosperity. Lorenzo Montanari. He's with Americans for Tax Reform and the Solis Foundation and is based in Washington, D.C. Magnus Örn Gunnarsson, one of the co-hosts of this event, he's CEO of the Center for Social and Economic Research based in Reykjavik, Iceland. And Rod Richardson, president of the Grace Richardson Fund and prime mover of this event, he'll set up today's conversation with a 10-minute keynote, then hand it over to Nick to begin the panel discussion. Again, we really appreciate all of you being here on such a busy day, so please help me welcome Rod Richardson.
Thank you all for coming here, and a big thank you to Atlas Network for helping us pull this all together. We really appreciate making the space at the Liberty Forum for us. So, thank you. And I want to ask you all a question, or at least think about it yourselves, and that is, why are you here? And I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here because I'm really worried about the liberty movement worldwide. I think the liberty movement is, suffering, struggling, and, in possibly under the worst threat that it's been in my adult lifetime. We need to think outside the box. We need to think about aggressive strategies to regain the momentum. There are people who should be, writing articles about economics who are having to pick up guns right now. So this is a very tough time for liberty around the world. Through Grace Richardson Fund, we try to pioneer new free market solutions to critical issues in gridlock. And this is a strategy that, I learned from my father way back when, and at the beginning of what is now the modern liberty movement, because when Sir Anthony came to New York to start his journey of building think tanks around the world, his headquarters was my family apartment. So I got to see what these guys built up close and personal, and I got to, the privilege of interacting with Sir Anthony while I was a teenager and a young man. I think that he would feel probably the same way now worried about the freedom movement and what's happening around the world and how liberty is being rolled back in numerous places. So the strategy of the Smith-Richardson Foundation was always to address the problems of the day with a better free market solution. And that is how I learned you should advance freedom, because if you address any question, no matter how ridiculous, but if there's a lot of passion behind it in the world and you show people that there's a better free market solution, you will advance freedom, one issue at a time, and co-opt the left, take their issues away from them. So I always found it a little strange that the conservative response on climate change seems to be, denial or skepticism. And, I don't mean that there's necessarily a problem with some of that skepticism. Some of those, remarks are well taken, and I agree with a lot of Bjorn Lomborg's points that he's raised. But if you don't have a free market solution, you will cede that issue to the left, and that's exactly what's happened. It's happened in the field of at all levels of government, including international agreements, where you see these international agreements being written that are very government-centric and restrict freedom. The Paris Agreement has a lot of stuff in it that it tends to towards these mandates and mechanisms that are very constrictive. You see other agreements too around the world, like the Global Minimum Tax Treaty, that are not exactly pro-freedom, that are constricting nations who want to lower their taxes as much as they want. So what I have to ask is there room for a coalition of think tanks to think outside the box and to radically accelerate freedom by working together to craft freedom-based international agreements? And I think that there's, based on my work, I think that there's a huge opportunity in the climate and environmental space because of all the passion behind it, and because of one fundamental observation, that the solution to both poverty and climate is one and the same thing, which is to expand freedom for innovators, entrepreneurs, and problem solvers globally, right? So if you can bake that fundamental principle into policy, into international agreements as the core of your approach, I think that there is tremendous, power to be had, and we could basically take over the climate movement with a free market message and a free market solution that makes much more sense than much of the stuff that's being done today. So let me tell you a little bit about my thinking on this. I think that we need to look for better strategy. And I think that we need to think about what were the most successful historical examples of attempts to open up markets, because that is the key problem, opening up markets. It's the problem because we're at an inflection point with clean technologies where in the last decade they went from unprofitable and uncompetitive to profitable and competitive. So that means that all of the old policy that people are still using these days is completely out of date. For a profitable and competitive technology, you need different kinds of policy. And the policy you need, if it's competitive, you need to let it compete. And that means you need to open up the markets, right? And that will have we can point to that having a huge and very important climate impact. There's a great study by Wayne Weingarten from the Pacific Research Institute that shows that in the United States, comparing competitive power markets like Texas to uncompetitive monopoly power markets, the competitive power markets are decarbonizing 66% faster. They're doing so 18% cheaper on retail and 22 to 23% cheaper on commercial markets, right? And they're doing so with better reliability, less blackouts, more recovery time. There's a great study by C3 Solutions, Nick Loris, who's in the room, who did a paper called "Free Economies or Clean Economies," correlating the index of economic freedom against the Yale Index of Environmental Performance. I think Lorenzo will tell us about a study that he's done along those lines as well. There's a great message to be had here to show as the basis of policy. So if opening up power markets and other things like land use, where there's far too much government ownership of rainforests resulting in the tragedy of the commons, private private land ownership would be a solution to deforestation. So there are all these free market solutions that are available out there. How do you open up markets around the world, right? The two of the best historical examples of doing so, of rapidly getting nations to drop their barriers, would be the formation of the United States and the Alexander Hamilton's plan for getting nations to join and sign up on the Constitution. The basic deal was there was a carrot that was offered. And that carrot was the federal government would assume the debts of the nations, of the states, who, were glad to get that debt off of their backs. And by doing so, that was an incentive to join up. But not only that, all of the investors in that bad debt suddenly were invested in the success of the United States. Suddenly, the United States had a lot of friends because those friends needed the United States to succeed in order to get paid back, right? It's a smart strategy. Another strategy that successfully created and caused nations to drop barriers was the Marshall Plan, which led to the creation of the European Common Market. Essentially, nations were offered Marshall Plan grants if they joined the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. And that required them to drop their their trade barriers and allow internal trade. Tariffs had been very high before then. So you see in both cases, a carrot is possible. Now, we've thought a lot about what would be, the best kind of carrot to use to break open trade around the world. The Grace Richardson Fund has done a lot of work with collaborative policy innovation with literally hundreds of scholars and think tanks and organizations, mostly in the United States, but around the world too, to think through the concept of what we call clean tax cuts. How would you use tax cuts, to address the environment and also to, change. I might need a couple more minutes, so I might run over a little bit, but or we can get back to this. But the essentially, there are ways to use supply side tax cuts. Internationally reciprocal supply side tax cuts might just be the carrot that you can use in an international agreement that would convince nations to join, because it would unlock massive international capital flows for those countries that sign on. So let me explain a couple of concepts of how this would work, right? For instance, one idea is the innovation acceleration bonds, loans, and savings accounts. These are a leveraged supply-side tax cut. The basic concept was suggested by Professor Travis Bradford at Columbia at one of our charrette expert working groups. And it is, a lot of people talk about applying, policy leverage, and they mean it in an entirely metaphorical sense, but this is actually a supply-side tax cut applied to financial leverage. And the effect of doing that, I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little wonky here, is that you're driving down the cost of debt, so you're driving down the cost of capital in these projects, which drives down the cost of things like clean energy, clean electricity, right? And you're doing so, by the way, in a very technologically neutral way, because these would apply to all technologies. And what you're doing is you're targeting this at, in each technology family, at the projects that are deployed using the best available control technologies, the top 50% of those, right? So you're addressing the negative externalities in, say, the oil and gas sector for reducing emissions at the wellhead, but you're also addressing bird kill for solar panel, for wind turbines, and the recyclability of solar panels. So, but driving down the cost of all those good things across technologically neutrally, you're also driving up the return on equity. So you're creating an incentive that is very, very attractive for governments, because you're attracting investment very, very democratically, both to tax-exempt debt and taxable equity, right, at the same time. And because return on debt is lower than debt on equity, in the last decade, for instance, in the United States, return on debt was about 4%, return on equity was about 13.6. That means that the government's take in 350% more tax revenue than they give up in tax expense, right? So you're getting a leverage effect on top of the dynamic effects of an ordinary supply-side tax cut. This means that you can use these in a very interesting way, in an attractive way for governments around the world, right? If you sign up to, say, this kind of agreement that we're talking about, which opens up markets, then you would get any bank or mutual fund or entrepreneur, hedge fund, investor of various kinds could raise money in any participating country using these debt instruments, from savings accounts, mutual funds, loans, etc. Tax-exempt debt, no interest, no tax on the interest, right? And they could use that in their own portfolio to invest in projects around the world. So you would, by signing up for this, you would have access to massive capital flows to do so, to adopt basically a free market framework for an international agreement. There are other ideas along these lines that we can get into. This might not be the perfect, instrument, but I think we need to think about what's the carrot for people to drop their barriers and open up their markets. So that's a key thing. There is also, before I turn it over to Nick, I'll say one thing. There is an agreement that is already being contemplated out there that is moving in this direction. And that is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability. That is an agreement that 6 nations have signed on to, and their plan is to develop that agreement. It is basically a free trade agreement for environmentally beneficial goods and services. The signatories right now are Iceland, New Zealand, Costa Rica, Norway, Switzerland, and Fiji. And we have had, that is an agreement that, because the idea is to develop that agreement, any one of these countries and the think tanks in those countries could push to develop this in a direction that is more of a complete free market agreement. So this is a project that is, it's not too much. It's something we could handle doing together. And you could create a real free market, an example of what does a free market environmentalist international agreement look like. And what you develop there could become an agreement of the willing, and it's something that could end up being baked into things like the Paris Agreement on their Article 6 considerations. You would argue basically that, hey, a free market is the best market mechanism, right? So without further, and I have to say, we've had, interest in pursuing that from several different think tanks from those countries, from Iceland, Costa Rica, New Zealand, from Norway, and from Switzerland. So we're there is a real possibility to do something like this. So in any event, with that, I'm sorry I've run over, but that's the background for this discussion.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Rod. Just a quick question to you, Rod, and then we're going to go to Magat for her comments. In the scenario that you just set up, and especially with the agreement among the 6 countries, how important is it either that a country like the U.S. or a large economy be involved, or is it better that they stay out until this kind of gets something going and there's kind of a proof of concept?
I think that it's much easier for the liberty movement to craft an agreement the way they would like to craft it if they don't get the bigger countries involved. I think that this should be thought of as developing a model free market agreement and developing a coalition of the willing, and then you start getting our American friends like Americans for Tax Reform and stuff like that saying, hey, if you want to address climate change, this is the right way to do it.
Right.
But if we get the U.S. in, we're working with the Biden administration. If we get Europe involved, some of those people don't know how to say free market.
All right, thank you, Magat. Do you want to talk about how the concept that Rod is talking about, and potentially the specific fix of supply side tax cuts, bonds, things like that? How does that, how do you feel about that in relation to Africa or other parts of the developing world?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and for having all of you and for being here. I guess for me, I love everything that Rod has been talking about, and I, at this point, have nothing to add to it except that I support it. But where I want to take your attention is more on when Rod was saying earlier, our ideas seem to be struggling these days. I remember back many, many years ago telling this side of the argument that our best bet to push our for our ideas would be to focus on the global poor, to really focus on the poors of the world. And if we, you know, I've always sat on that side of it. How do these ideas, you know, impact the global poor? Usually that's the place where the argument is cleanest made, most unassailable, really. Because here, the waters are muddied by so many forces, and frankly, people are too comfortable here to even listen to half of what we have to say. So when it comes to the climate, we have the same problem. So everything Rod says, and I'm going to be definitely going to be working with you guys on these coalitions, but before we can even give these coalitions a chance, we have to also get our voice in the narrative. Like you said, for the longest time, we're almost like seen as deniers of the climate. I certainly was never on that camp, but I've always been. So right now, my point is for them to even hear the solutions we're proposing, they have to even feel like there is a problem about their solutions, and they're not right now. As with everything, they hold the moral high ground. And that moral high ground is important for us to reclaim. So what I'm talking about here is deconstruct their narrative, rebuild the narrative, and because we don't just criticize, we criticize by creating, we then create. So we have at this point to criticize, and I don't think we've been doing that right, and then we plug in the creation part that we're talking about here. And this is where we come in. This is where the Africa Center for Prosperity comes in. Because right now, the narrative right there, when it comes to the climate, it's very clear for them. Climate is at stake. The world is at stake, and so we must stop all fossil fuel emissions by tomorrow. When you look at the timelines they give us, in human time, it's tomorrow they want us to change. And it's simply not feasible. And where it's the clearest, there is no argument, is in the developing nations. And take the case of Africa in this case. So we Africans stand to push back on their narrative because we are their Achilles heel. We're the Achilles heel of the climate change, the climate action narrative. We are. Everywhere I've tried it, it worked. They back off because they've got nothing else to come back with. So here, what I'm proposing is we go in together. We march forward with, you guys are full of it, and we make the case, and then this is what we propose. That's where you guys come in. So that's what I more wanted to.
So I know you have to leave in a minute or two, but can you talk about that broader narrative? Is it that the West or that free market people don't care about the global poor? Their wealth is built on that. Is that the first part of the narrative that needs to be deconstructed, and then the energy stuff comes later?
It's even worse what's going on. We're beyond, they don't care. Basically what's going on is we have gotten to where we have gotten, but too bad Earth cannot sustain one more item of CO2. So everybody needs to stop everywhere. And so you Africans have to just tough luck almost. But they're not even realizing that they're telling us tough luck. And so we're here to tell them, no, you're telling us we have to die now for some thing to happen 10, 12 years from now. So we have to hold their feet to the fire. I want you to go on record. Are you saying that we're going to condemn 1.3 billion Africans? I'm not even counting the other poors of the world, but 1.3 billion Africans. Oh, and by the way, 1 billion of these are blacks, representing 90% of the black race. You're telling me that they have to die now to supposedly save something that's going to come in 12 years. I just want you to go on record. If you go on record, thank you very much. I'll keep it. And if you can't, then you got to work with me to work on alternatives. And then we come up with what's going on over here.
Can I, Rod, to go to that point, it seems to me part of the argument, at least in the West or in the United States, is that, well, actually you don't have to die because all of these technologies exist and they can be implemented immediately overnight at the snap of a finger if it wasn't for vested interests in the U.S. and the West. Or it might be Putin, but in the U.S. it's coal and oil, and they're blocking, we can just airdrop solar panels and wind farms into Africa. Is that part of the problem here? And how do you talk about getting from where we are to where we need to be in terms of clean, ubiquitous clean fuel or energy?
You're right that there is that kind of simple-minded view that we have all the technologies we really need, and it's
Why
all
don't
fine.
they use it? Why doesn't Germany right now use it for itself? Why is it coming to Africa, taking our fossil fuels to heat themselves this winter? Why don't they? It's already. I'm sorry. Show me the way, please.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that I try to stay away from is championing or demonizing any technology, because I think that and you hear this a lot on the conservative side and on the liberal side. Some people love nuclear and they love fossil fuels, or they love wind and they love solar, and or they hate fossil fuels or they hate wind and solar. Let's be really clear about this. No energy technologies are perfect. Every technology has major problems. Some energy technologies work way better in some locations than in others. Icelandic geothermal is not available everywhere. There's some places where solar is actually pretty good in Africa, but so you have a lot of problems. But if I may just offer a quick comment on the whole, idea of you guys are full of it. I think you can reduce that to one word, which I'd like to introduce into the English language, which is govtardery, right? Which is the government retard put them together. So I think that's mostly what's going on at COP27 is govtardery. So
To pick up on that,
I think mockery is a really good idea.
Part of underlying this, and I know, Magat, you talk a lot about this, I've heard Rod say too, that free markets are clean markets, and free markets are good for poor people. Has that message started coming through to Africans, if not to their governments? And I'm thinking, Bono, the U2 singer, released a biography recently, and he was following on comments that he's been making pretty much for about the past 5 or 10 years, that he realized in all of the aid work that he did that it was markets that lifted people out of poverty, not aid. Is that message getting through, and is that something to build off of?
Absolutely. My husband, because you guys don't live with me, he does. And sometimes I get so depressed because I'm like, Michael, how many more times am I going to have to say this for people to hear? He's like, it's only when you're sick of saying it that they're starting to hear you. And I think he's been right. I am literally tired of saying, taking this around to people think I'm crazy. But no, it is starting to pick up steam. And so this too, we can add it to it. And so that's why I say, let's be smart. That's why I've always loved Atlas Network, because they're the ones in the liberty movement that really focuses the most on international. With less time, less resources, less fight, you can make your case in such a clean manner, like I said, unassailable. Work with us. At the African Center for Prosperity of Atlas Network, this is going to be the stake we put on the ground coming up this year. We are going to put our voice on this whole climate change narrative, and our goal is we're going to create a campaign where the voices of Africans come from the bottom up, and we're going to have targets for them to go after. I mean, if you don't stand with us, you're going to have to go and hide somewhere. That's just the way it's going to be.
Let's shift from Africa to Iceland. Magnus, talk about the opportunities that Rod's plan presents in Iceland, which is a place that has ubiquitous, good, clean energy in terms of geothermal and wind and whatnot, or hydroelectric. Yet the market there is not a particularly free one.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Unlike Africa, Iceland does not have the potential of having solar power at all. We've got water, and geothermal, which is absolutely fantastic. We're one of the few European nations right now that do not feel the effect of the energy crisis. It's still, I could keep the lights on in my apartment for a whole month. It would maybe cost me $150. Cheap, really good. And the unique thing about the market and the opportunities that come with it in Iceland is that it's very well technologically developed. It's plentiful in available resources to produce more. And it's almost fully public or government run. But at the same time, it turns over insane dividends for the government corporations. So working on trying to privatize this market, which has started in the Icelandic parliament now. Rod came to Iceland. He's come to Iceland 2 times in the past 2 months to discuss with members of parliament, trying to focus the efforts on trying to make it more freer market with the opportunities that we have there. Yeah.
You should tell them a little bit about the benefits, the end game of making it freer. What can you accomplish if you make it freer?
I mean, the way I view it is that since it's such a small country, it's very easy to use it as a role model for other systems, and it's very, it's socially. I'm not going to talk about that. I would say using it as a role model for other nations to build up their energy systems, and also as a driving factor in e-fuel technology, because we're pumping so much money into e-fuel technologies. We're trying to put
Could you just explain what that is, e-fuel?
and environmental fuels, so mostly electric, hydrogen, electric, and
Like green hydrogen, zero emission fuels.
yeah. So right now, because of the energy crisis, a lot of the focus in Europe has been coming to Iceland to try to set up hydrogen factories to ship to Europe, which is, in my opinion, the best possible future for Iceland as an economy to become a net exporter of energy. Not everybody agrees with me in the libertarian movement on that, because that means we'll raise the prices on internal energy. But the opportunities there are so plentiful to develop the market and make it a lot bigger. And yeah.
Rod, could you talk a little bit in that context of how do you take Icelandic geothermal energy and get it to Fiji? Or, how does it work for them to be in a climate change or, an energy alliance?
Well, Magnus is right. Basically, Iceland could be, the Abu Dhabi of zero emission fuels. They have what's needed there to do it. They have, geothermal has a cost advantage over all the other renewables because it has this free zero emission heat, which reduces the cost of electrolysis, and it's on all the time, right? So there's the potential for them to crack the code on how to make those things profitable and competitive. But they will never get there as long as their power sector is 93% government run. Because to develop those kinds of entrepreneurial-led innovation, you need competition. The entrepreneurs need access to the resources. So, there is this fear about, opening up the Icelandic market to selling their energy to Europe by, giving, putting in a cable to the UK, selling the energy, letting European factories come set up to do zero emission production of industrial goods or aluminum or hydrogen or whatever. This fear is that if you plug in to that European market, you're going to end up paying European prices. One way to solve for that would be to say, okay, fine, we're going to fence off the monopoly. We'll leave the residential customers with this, the same rates, and what we'll do is we'll open up competition and new resources for private developers that are dealing with commercial and export and stuff like that. So you basically get a fenced off market. So those prices stay the same for Iceland in that market, but you develop competition so that would be one way to do it.
I mean, I mean, that is a fantastic way to do it, like we've discussed many times. The battle we have ahead of us in Icelandic energy markets is so massive. Even though we have the full support of the largest political party in Iceland, the Independence Party, all the other parties are against this. Even the socialists are against this.
Is that
But
why? I mean, is that ideological, or is it also because, when Iceland, when you look at the financial collapse and things like that, I mean, is it still smarting from the idea where an island, that's on its own, and then when we get embroiled in European affairs or global affairs, suddenly we end up on the hook for everything?
I mean, yeah, for sure. But I think it's it's a very conservative nation when it comes to drastic changes. Privatizing the energy market is a very drastic change. A good example on that is that we still have a state monopoly on alcohol and tobacco. And we have one type of milk. Honestly, there's one brand of milk. There are 3 types, but it's one brand of milk. I can't even get, proper Parmesan cheese. It's illegal to import it. Thank you, sir.
Lorenzo, do you want to talk about how you are the person who has worked with, through Americans for Tax Reform and international agreements, kind of doing this type of stuff? Where do you go from there, and what is the role that property rights play in kind of pushing this type of thing forward?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Really, Rod and Risa Foundation. It's difficult to add something interesting after these 3 great presentations. So I hear about that we need a new narrative. So if we need a new narrative, we need to recognize what is the other narrative. So I would start saying that the radical environmentalist narrative is slipping into a very sterile and counterproductive criticism of the capitalistic system. So if we should criticize, if we should blame the capitalistic system, so then we should consider the Soviet Union or the communist regime an environmental paradise, where we know exactly that the biggest environmental crime is being committed precisely there, in those countries where property rights are limited or even absent. So I'm saying that because in our study, the International Property Rights Index, and I'm glad that the C3 solution compared with the Heritage Foundation, we discovered there is a strong correlation between property right protection and the Yale Environmental Index as well. So we are talking about a correlation of 0.829, so it's very high. So this means that, and we discovered that the top 10 countries that in the ranking better in the Yale Environmental Performance Index is the same top 10 country that performing well in the property right protection in our index. So this is the starting point how to rebuild the narrative. So we need to rebuild the narrative around the free market principle, property right protection, free trade value. And this is the 3 pillars where, as a think tank around the world, we need to build coalitions. Otherwise, we will not be able to win the battle, because these 3 main principles are not only compatible, but are essential to defend the global environment. Without this, we can't win any battle. So the experience of ATR is basically, in 1993, we start organizing the so-called Wednesday meeting to answer the need to bring together libertarians, conservative, moderate Republicans, activists, center-right activists as well. They are sharing at least a common background of less taxation, more society, more freedom, less state intervention, and so on. So we have been doing this type of coalition, policy breakfast coalition meeting, that whatever you want to call it, every Wednesday from 10, 11:30 off the record under Chatham House rules. And we have 23 speakers up to 150, 180 participants. All leaders of think tanks, business community, activists, they participate with a hidden agenda, and they share what everyone is doing. So it became the most important policy breakfast in Washington. So we have, and this is a policy tool, let's say tools to influence the public opinion, to influence the policymakers, and to build a network and strengthen the network among the think tanks. Because everyone needs to know what everyone is doing. We have here among us, Jordan Williams is doing the coalition meeting in New Zealand. There are 18 coalition meetings all over the world. Before COVID, BC was 26, but following the same modality. We have been doing also the international coalition meeting every month, same modality with the international leaders. Sig from the RSC spoke last month. Roberto Salinas, most of you already presented. The idea is to build a network around the free market and conservative principle. And this is the only way we can together build a new narrative, because the leftists are divided. We are more united than them, even if according to our lack of PR or lack of communication, we look more divided than them. So we need to follow this path of building coalitions, sharing what we are doing, because this is the only way we can win the battle. So this is following what discussion with Rod, we are happy eventually to start this coalition meeting or the international coalition network with the 6 major countries. They signed this interesting agreement, and from them growing organically.
Rod, can I follow up on that and to talk specifically about energy issues? And this might be more of a U.S. focus, although I think it's also true in Europe, to the extent of my knowledge. And you talk a lot about this. The right, broadly speaking, and that includes conservatives, libertarians, free market people, for most, at least since Al Gore, wrote Earth in the Balance, has been dead set against environmentalist values. It's common. It seems to be changing a little bit, but they hate tree huggers. George H.W. Bush in the late '80s ran on saying, he supported loggers over owls in old growth forests and things like that. So, what are the successes that you've seen, or where are the places within the right narrative that is anti-green? Everybody hates Greta Thunberg. Like, why are we listening to this child, et cetera? How do we come up with a story that actually shows that people on the right care about the environment and care about the poor? And that might be a separate issue, but how do we start changing the idea that, we want to be able to throw our garbage out on the side of the road like we used to before the crying Indian?
So I'm going to address that, but before I do, I just wanted to ask for a round of applause for ATR's eagerness to actually help form this new coalition, because that is actually, ATR has not been active in the environmental or climate questions. They've tried to stay out of that because it's messy with all the tax credits, subsidies, blah blah blah. But I think I've managed to convince them that supply side tax cuts globally might be worth supporting. So, if so, this is actually a kind of a huge change that they're stepping into this. So again, kudos to ATR, Lorenzo.
So we've
Chris
got
Butler.
the table set, and now
Grover.
what's the story that should be circulated?
So basically, I personally think that the main message is that freedom is the solution for nearly everything, and it's the solution for climate and the environment too. A lot of people are running around saying, "Oh, we need to put equity and justice at the heart of the climate movement, women at the heart of the climate movement," which is great. But the real thing we need to put at the heart of the climate movement is freedom, because when you put freedom at the heart of the climate movement, you get everything else too. You get the women, you get the justice, you get the equity, right? So I think that the message that the solution to poverty, climate, and the environment is all the same thing. It's more freedom. Is a powerful, simple message that I think will turn the tide. And by the way, I just want to say that there really is a strong environmental streak in the conservative movement. Going back to my dad and Sir Anthony, they both were entrepreneurs involved in aquaculture. Anthony started a turtle farm in the Cayman Islands where he was releasing turtles into the wild, protected turtles, so they could grow up and survive the sharks and releasing them into the wild. And he was supporting the green sea turtle population by doing that, the wild population. My dad, was motivated by, considerations about, feeding the world and, cleaning up the waterways, but with, aquaculture. So they had strong environmental motivations behind their business aspirations. Those kinds of I think that spirit is still out there in the world in many entrepreneurs. And, I think that we need to channel that in the, conservative and libertarian movement a little more. And I think people will start to get it.
All right. We have time for questions, and I want to go out in the audience. Please raise your hand. I'm going to walk out, and I'll let you talk. Okay, so let's go first back here. And I will insist that it's a question, not a statement or a lecture, and I'll hold on to the mic.
Sure. Should I stand up? Or?
You can stand up.
Rod asked me to do a short intervention, but I'm gonna turn it into a question.
Do the full intervention in at 2:00 when we're doing a think tank roundtable. Think
Sure.
tanks will be able to
Sure.
talk. But go ahead.
So yeah, I come from a country called Lebanon where we have 22 hours of blackout a day. We don't have electricity. And the only reason we cannot have renewable energy projects in Lebanon because the government has a monopoly over the production of electricity. So I cannot develop a solar farm and sell electricity, although the solar farm in Lebanon would produce electricity much cheaper than the government. So having this international agreement that you guys are talking about might be able to force the hand of those governments in those countries to actually open up their sectors and allow for private businesses to develop those solutions. So how do you see the buy-in of those countries who are attached to their cronies and they want to maintain what they have? How would they react to those kinds of agreements? Thank you.
Thank you. And, Magnus, maybe you want to take a crack at it because your country is that. It's just that they have plentiful energy, right? Like why, if your state-owned utilities are paying massive dividends, why would they give it up?
They definitely don't want to give it up. They're cronies. It's kind of a weird thing trying for Iceland to be some sort of systematic role model for a country in any way. We always strive towards, our former First Lady, she said Iceland is the biggest country in the world. We're so big, we're always number one per capita. We're number one in gender equality, number one in wage equality, some stuff like that. But it's really difficult for us to export or be a role model for anybody because we think our system works.
So it's Icelandic exceptionalism.
Yes.
I think every country has a version of that. Okay, Rod, do you have a quick question or a comment
Sure.
on how do you crack the Lebanon question?
When crafting policy, you need to really get people together to work on these questions. So we use something called charrette process where we get experts together. So I think that is a difficult question that needs to be handled. How do you get those cronies? So we do have a couple of suggestions. Like for instance, there is something, one of the ideas that we've worked on developing is called demonopolization tax cuts, where basically you let the cronies exit from their monopoly without any taxes, right? So that, you give them a big one-time reward for getting out, and then you let them back in on a competitive basis with tax advantages as well. So you basically buy off the cronies, is a way to do it. But, it makes sense because that sale would never actually happen unless you offered an incentive like that.
That's great.
So you need.
So just in the interest of getting to a few more questions before we have to break, that's fantastic. And that sounds like the type of idea that ATR and its meetings can start passing around, right? DeRoy Murdoch, what's your question?
Hello, DeRoy Murdoch, Atlas Network, Fox News, and other outlets. Two things briefly. Does this treaty exist and you're hoping for people to sign it, or is it an idea and hope to negotiate it at some point, number one? And number two, when you look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act and Obama's Clean Air Plan, all that spending, all that regulation, all those things reduce temperature by like 0.002 degrees Fahrenheit, like from 72 degrees down to 71.98. I mean, if this really is a crisis that's going to kill us, let's do something that actually reduces temperature. What do you make of the fact that these huge government interventions of the left really do almost nothing to reduce temperature?
Number one, the ACS agreement does exist. We have Jordan here. New Zealand is a signatory. There are 6 other nations. But it is also an agreement in development. So they're still tinkering with the language and planning on bringing it globally. That's why there is room in this particular agreement for a free market intervention to develop a free ACS, the free agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. That would be more of a free market thing. Again, those examples that you point out are a good time to use the word gov-tartary. Because that's what it is. It's like really stupid policy that doesn't actually work. When something like we're talking about would actually work. It would you would eventually get to the competitive zero emission fuels and the stuff like that that will actually move the needle. But they're not moving the needle, by deploying technologies that are not really ready for prime time and intermittent and unreliable and needing fossil fuel backups. It's, and especially the kind of subsidies they're using. Part of the problem with the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act is that only the Berkshire Hathaways of the world can use that kind of stuff.
That's really surprising, isn't it?
Everybody else other than Berkshire Hathaway has to be big enough to afford the bankers and the lawyers, to trade the tax equity.
Right.
This is a welfare program for lawyers and bankers. And the worst thing about it is that the small, innovative entrepreneurs, the guys that have projects 10 or 15 million bucks, like your partner Drew, are frozen out from this market. So we're creating a market structure in solar.
All right, we have time for one final question, sir.
So I remember only in the 80s and 90s, there was all this talk of peak oil. The solution to peak oil was that in the private sector, we had a technology revolution and they discovered fracking, and then we had too much oil. So from the private sector came a solution to what appeared to be lack of oil. I think from the private sector will come also the solution to climate change, to the CO2 emissions. Agreements between governments can also focus on incentivizing solutions from the private sector, where several governments get together to put up money to incentivize the private sector. That's something worth pursuing. Have you considered that?
Thank
you. Run that by me again.
I think yeah.
It depends on how basically, prizes are good, like an X prize, that's good. But, basically, I prefer supply side tax cuts, because when governments put up money, they're basically taking the money from the taxpayers. They're robbing Peter to pay Paul. One of the reasons I prefer supply side tax cuts is that you're just letting Paul keep more of his own profits. So I would try to stick with that model of using that, because when you rob Peter to pay Paul, there's going to be a lot of Pauls out there that are basically, losers. They're not really doing it right. They're not. And by supporting them, you're taking money away from the people who are actually, pushing the successful innovation. So the redistributive model has problems. The robbing Peter to pay Paul always results in inefficiencies.
We are about out of time, but Rod, to build on that and a previous comment, maybe as a final wrap up, could you maybe talk a little bit about the demonopolization question of where you buy out the monopoly owners, the actors. Is there a way, governments are a big part of the problem here, and how do you pay off governments to get out of the energy market or to block this kind of technology neutral innovation that you're talking about, which is it'll leave them and the planet better off, but they won't get to control who gets to do what, where, and what the tax rate is in the same way. So could you maybe speak a little to that?
Well, we've talked about demonopolization tax cuts. We've talked about, these kind of international capital flows. So those are two mechanisms that I've mentioned where you're providing a carrot for some of the players involved. The governments themselves, maybe there is the necessity for something like a Marshall Plan grant, the government to government aid, because that's what foreign aid is. It's basically a bribe, and that money goes into the pockets of the politicians. So maybe at the end of the day, we're going to have to say that, to create a really big free market, we have to do something like the Marshall Plan did, which is use something that free marketeers don't really like, because the carrot is, what the carrot is less important than the goal of opening up a market. So we might have to go there, but I think that let's lead with supply side tax cuts first and get people involved in that, and then see if we have to go another step.
Great. Thank you very much. Are you wrapping up? And you will talk about what's coming this afternoon then? Okay, so thank you, Rod. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Magnus. And thank Magat.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Nick, Magnus, Magat, Lorenzo, and Rod. And thank you all. We're going to break for lunch upstairs and reconvene in this room, 2 o'clock. We can dig into some more of the things that we heard this morning and try to see what will work, how to put the coalition together, anything like that. It'll be a more free-flowing discussion. We welcome all of you back. Thanks very much for coming, everyone.